Today we're going to talk about one of the most influential philosophers of the second half of the 20th century. He just died a few years ago, a guy called Derek Parfit. Now, Parfit's views are very much influenced by Locke's, and in fact, part of what he does is he defends a version of Locke's theory against criticisms like the ones we saw given by Thomas Reid. That's part of what he does, but then he also does something very radical, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it's worth very quickly recapping Locke, just to give the sort of background to Parfit. So, first important distinction in Locke is the distinction between what he calls man, which is basically human, and person. The human is the animal, essentially the physical thing that is alive. But there's also, he says, each of us is also a person. Now, what is the person? Well, he says a person is not a body and it's not a soul. If you remember his Prince and the Cobbler example illustrates that it's not the body, because when the Prince and the Cobbler swap consciousnesses so that the person inside the prince's body has the memories and personality of the cobbler, we would say that that's the cobbler, even though it has the prince's body. So who is that person who looks like the prince, who has the prince's body? We would say it's the cobbler. So that shows that the body is not what makes you who you are. Similarly, perhaps more radically, he argues that it is not the soul either. So this would be against someone like Descartes, because if you remember, Descartes says, what am I? I am a thinking thing. And he decides that what I am is the thing that thinks, which is my mind or soul. So Locke rejects that. And the important example there is where he has a conversation with a mayor of this small town that begins with Q, who believes that he has Socrates' soul. And Locke says, let's suppose he's right. Even if he has Socrates' soul, that doesn't make him Socrates. Whereas, of course, if you were what your soul was, then you would be then if it was Socrates' soul, it would still be Socrates. And the reason why he says it's not Socrates is because the guy has no memories of Socrates. And this makes the important point that even if your soul survives in the afterlife, if it was scrubbed clean of all your memories, you'd be gone. You wouldn't exist anymore. Just as the atoms that make up your body are basically as old as the universe. That's kind of an interesting thought. How old is this? It's as old as the universe. All of the atoms that make me up have been around since the dawn of time, essentially. And they will continue to exist long after I'm dead. But that doesn't mean that I'll continue to exist. And the same argument goes for the soul, that maybe I'm made of a soul and a body, but even if they continue to exist after I'm gone, I'll be gone, unless my consciousness survives. So Locke's theory of what makes the person is whatever has the consciousness. So to the question of, am I the same person as the kid in the school picture when I'm in kindergarten? And he asks, well, can you remember being that kid? And if you can, then you are. You share consciousness in some sense. Now, we also saw Reid's criticisms of this view. First of all, Locke admits that Locke himself says this has strange implications. For example, it's possible that one body can contain two persons, in that he gives the sort of weird case of suppose you have different consciousnesses in the night and the day. So most of us don't remember our dreams, but imagine when you go to sleep, you just pick up a life that, so when you go to sleep, you remember all of your nights that have gone before, and you don't have any memory of your days. So it's as if your nights are just like your days, in that in our days, we remember the previous days. Well, imagine in your nights, you remember the previous nights, except neither stream of consciousness has any contact with the other one. In that case, you would be two different persons in the same body. And he's okay with this. And he's also okay with the idea that because person is connected to issues concerning praise and blame, if I have no memory of a horrendous crime that I committed, well, I'm begging the question there by saying I committed it. Suppose I am found in a body that is covered with blood, and on camera is that body stabbing someone repeatedly, but I have no memory of doing that, then the person that is me is not guilty of the stabbing, even though it took place in the body that I now occupy, because I have no consciousness of that. Those are all kind of weird implications, but Locke says, meh, that's what, it's the right theory. Too bad if it has weird implications. So it's not enough to show that it's a weird theory unless it's so weird that we can't tolerate that. What Reed wants to show is that it's not just weird, it doesn't make sense. And that's the example of the general, where he says, we want to know, is the general the same person as the little boy? And he says Locke's theory gives two inconsistent answers, and therefore it's a useless theory because it doesn't answer the question, or worse yet, it gives two completely opposite answers. Why does it give two opposite answers? Well, because in one sense, the general must be the same as the little boy because he's the same as the young soldier, because he remembers being the young soldier, and the young soldier is the same as the little boy, so he must be the same. But at the same time, he doesn't remember being the little boy, so if having direct consciousness of being the little boy is required, then he can't be the little boy. So, but how can you have two separate answers? Now, the response to that we've already seen, a possible fix for that is what Stephen Law calls the rope idea, which results in what he calls the stream theory. Stephen Law, remember, is the Philosophy Files guy, which says that instead of requiring for me to be the same as that kid in kindergarten, instead of requiring that I have to remember being that kid, all that it requires is that I remember being someone who remembered being someone who remembered being someone who remembered being that kid. And that's much easier to do because, I don't remember being 3, but I do remember being 5, and when I was 5, I remembered being 4, and when I was 4, I remembered being 3. So therefore, by the stream theory, there's a chain of memories that traces back to that 3-year-old, so therefore I am that 3-year-old. And then there's no inconsistency. You don't get two different responses, both by the chain of memories and identity, I am the 3-year-old. So you get the right. And furthermore, this makes the consciousness theory seem a little less strange because it would be weird if, my parents said, oh, look at you, you were a beautiful baby. And I say, well, that's not me because I don't remember being me. This one says it doesn't require that I directly remember it. A second criticism in Reed is that the theory is circular, that Locke's theory is circular. It says, I am what I remember, but then if you look at the definition of memory, memory is something that happened to me. Because what's the difference between memory and fantasy? I could remember doing something, and at the same time I could have an image of me shooting JFK from the grassy knoll. Maybe I got the second one from, watching Oliver Stone's movie JFK too late at night after ingesting things that I shouldn't, and I've become convinced that it was me who shot JFK. We would want to say that's not really a memory because it didn't really happen to me. But then what Reed points out is you can't define memory as something that happens to me if at the same time you're going to turn around and say what I am is what I remember. So as a result, Locke's theory can't distinguish between real and false memories, because a real memory is something that actually happened to me, and a false memory is something that I just think I remember but didn't really happen to me. And I can't make that distinction if I define myself in terms of my memories. There is a fix for this that Parfit suggests, and he's not the only one. And this is essentially to say, okay, I'm just going to not define memories in terms of me. Don't define memory using me. Instead of saying a memory is something that happened to me, say a memory that was caused to the body that I currently occupy, or something like that. There are ways around it. I don't want to get into too much detail, but they suggest a response that gets past that. The third criticism that you see in the Reed case is he says if you define personhood in terms of consciousness, well, the trouble with consciousness is it's very fleeting. I mean, if you think about it, you don't have direct experience of anything longer than about a second ago. Beyond that, it's memory. Now, he's already pointed out the problem with doing it in terms of memory, but if Locke says, okay, I'm going to do it in terms of direct consciousness, after all, if I prick my finger, I feel pain, so I definitely say this is my finger because I'm directly conscious of it. Well, only for about a second, and then past that time, I just have memories of that. But if I am just what I have direct consciousness of, then me as an individual is incredibly fleeting. I only exist for about a second at a time. There are some philosophers that are totally okay with this. David Hume, a very great philosopher, seems to have a view something like this. There's a contemporary philosopher called Galen Strawson, who is still alive. He's in Texas, if that counts as being alive. And he says that, yeah, I only exist for a very short period of time, and I'm okay with that. So that's not a knockdown criticism like the inconsistent one, if it worked. Finally, duplication. Now, in the reading that I gave you, he doesn't talk about duplication, but there were other critics of Locke at the time, Berkeley, for example, whom we've already encountered, who bring up this case. And this became a big deal in more recent discussions of personal identity. An example of duplication is described in that little story that I've put in your readings called You and Yours. But it's also described in the Stephen Law, where you imagine if you get into a transporter and it takes you to the place that you wanted to go, but by some malfunction it also produces a version of you somewhere else. I think the examples I gave is it produces a copy of you in Paris and a copy of you in Hawaii. And of course, neither of them knows about the other. Both of them have memories of going into this transporter booth in Flint, pressing the button, and then they go they arrive at the place they arrive at. And they don't know that this other one exists. Another case of duplication is in the classic cartoon Calvin and Hobbes. There's a whole series of Calvin and Hobbes cartoons where he duplicates himself. And his idea is that it's going to get him off work because the duplicates can do work for him. But of course, they are having none of this because they're just like Calvin and they're lazy too. It's a great series. You should look it up. So what's the problem with duplication? Well, it seems to mess with our notions of identity, because rather like the case of the old general, we are given a set of options, all of which are unpalatable. So we have A disappears. Remember, if it's a working transporter, I get destroyed once I use it, and then I appear in Paris, normally. But in this case, I appear in Paris and Hawaii. So, what are my options? B is A. So in other words, this person says, I'm Simon Cushing. The other option, and let's assume that rules out C being A. So B is A and C isn't. Alternatively, you have C is A and B isn't. And then, of course, the other possibilities in theory are both and neither. And as I said last time, neither of these seems to work because each one of them has an equal claim. And if you say B is A but C isn't, what are your grounds for saying so? Any grounds you have for saying that B is A, you have exactly the same grounds for saying that C is A, as C will point out to you in court if it's like the you and yours story. All right, well, let's try and keep them both happy. Let's say they're both A. But how is that possible? How can they both be A? Because they're not each other. B is obviously not the same person as C, as Calvin very quickly finds out when he gets into a fight with his duplicates. You can't get into a fight with somebody if they're the same person. So it seems like that means that they can't both be the original person. Although there is a contemporary philosopher who also died fairly recently called David Lewis, who has an interesting suggestion for how that might be possible. And something like that is discussed in You and Yours, but we're not going to get into that. So the other possibility is neither. Neither B is A nor C is A. And this is essentially the single stream theory, which is the name that Stephen Law calls it. The single stream theory essentially says, it's just like the stream theory. It says you are whoever you remember being, but it adds one extra clause, so long as there is no branching or duplication. If more than one person remembers it, then neither of them count as the original. Now, that's an answer that solves the duplication puzzle. So here we have the answer to the division cases. The single stream theory, sorry, that shouldn't be cases, that should be single stream theory. So the single stream theory says that neither of them are. But there's a problem with that. And this is pointed out in the Stephen Law chapter. And Parfit also has a problem with this. Not in the reading that you've got, but in another reading. He says, why should double success be failure? And what this means is, if only one of them made it, that obviously doesn't cover that up from your view because you're looking for the other side, but if only one of them made it, if only B had made it, then we would have no problem. The single stream the single stream theory would say, yes, B is A. And if only C had made it, we would say, yes, C is A. But when both of them make it, we say neither of them are A. That's weird. Why should double success, instead of just one of them making it, both of them make it, why should that undermine both of them? That seems weird. And this is basically making the same point as Law's duplicator gun example, where if you get duplicated, then you cease to exist. Which seems stupid, because you might not even know that you've been duplicated. So why should something that happens to you and you don't even know mean that you're no longer the person you used to be? That's just strange. So it's a reason to think that the single stream theory has a problem. Another criticism, another response to duplication cases, which I suspect a lot of people have on reading these, and in fact reading a lot of philosophy, is why do we have to read this? This is just bullshit. It's just science fiction. It's not real life. What has this got to do with reality? Well, if you say that, then you're not going to like most philosophy, which is probably okay with you, but philosophers would say you're kind of missing the point. It's not just science fiction, because these fanciful cases still reveal something about the theory, because the theory gives a definite answer to these fanciful cases, and it's an answer that is unacceptable. So it shows that even though the theory works in cases that we're familiar with, the theory still has theoretical problems. It can't handle things it hasn't encountered before. So still reveals a problem with the theory. But in this case, it's not just sci-fi. Or at least we can't have teleportation, and in fact physicists say it may never be possible to have teleportation. Although actually some physicists say we've already done it, but only with like single particles. But to duplicate an entire human person, some estimates say it would take more energy than there is in the galaxy or something. So it's just not, we're never going to get transporters, probably. But something that has the same effect has happened, or so it appears. And this finally brings us to the Parfit paper. Well, it will in a second. Another response to the division cases is to say that the division case reveals that the problem is with Locke's theory of defining persons in terms of consciousness. And a way to avoid that is to say, well, let's go right back to the beginning where Locke says there are humans and persons and we are the persons. Let's say, no, we are the humans, not the persons. So what I am is not my consciousness, it's this living animal. So in other words, and there's a few arguments you can give for this. For example, suppose I were to get a brain injury and be effectively brain dead, but my body was still alive. People talk about that and they would say, oh, Simon is being kept alive on a ventilator. They don't say, oh, Simon ceased to exist, but there's a body there that used to contain him. We talk as if I'm still alive. But then in response to that, we could say, well, when I'm finally dead, Locke would say it's not the human anymore because the human has to be alive. But we still talk. Oh, we say Simon is buried there. So the way we talk might not be the best indication. But another argument for that we're humans, and incidentally, this is the position of a contemporary of Parfit's that they used to have back and forth. They were both at Oxford University. There's a guy called Bernard. He's called Bernard, not Bernard, because he was English. Bernard Williams. He basically argued that we're humans. And if you look at the case I described last time of the transporter that fails. So you're in Flint, you press the button, a copy appears in Paris, but you're not destroyed. Well, then you wouldn't say, oh, now there's no way to choose between these two. You would say, no, I'm the original, and that's just a copy. Why am I the original? Because I've got the original living body. And although that's a living body, it's a new one, so it's not me. And I think most of us would agree with that. So Williams used that kind of example to argue that we're humans. However, the problem with saying that is that even if what makes us us is being in the same living body, well, you can have division cases even with living bodies, because actually we don't assume that to be the same person we have to have exactly the same bodies. For example, I could lose an arm, and even though I would not be exactly the same living body, everybody would say I'm the same man. I'm the same man, I'm the same human, just with one fewer arm. And in fact, you could lose an awful lot of you and still count as you surviving, so long as you kept your brain. We tend to think that our brain is the really important part. So if my brain, as in Futurama, got preserved in a little jar and attached to a robot body, I would just say, well, that's still me. Now I've got robot hands. Oh well, but it's still me because I've kept my brain. So the most important part of the living animal is clearly the brain. And you can have division cases with brains. David Wiggins is another British philosopher, and he described a case that Parfit talks about on the last page of the Parfit reading. And I'm going to give a version of it here. So there are these three triplets, and they're all involved in a horrible accident. And the accident destroys most of the body of the first one, but preserves the brain. Whereas for the other two, it has the opposite effect. It preserves their bodies, but their heads get squished. Okay, and here's what happens, because they have genius surgeons around. You take the right hemisphere of A's brain and you put it in this body. And Parfit calls them righty and lefty. So this one is righty because it gets the right hemisphere, and this one is called lefty because obviously it gets the left hemisphere. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, half a brain, what's the point of that? They won't be able to function as separate individuals. Oh, won't they? The reason why Wiggins came up with this example was because of these famous split brain cases. Finally, we get to the split brain cases. I've included a little video of an interview of one of the people that had this surgery. And the surgery is essentially, so everybody has two hemispheres of their brain. And they have a sort of bundle of nerves that connect the hemisphere of the brain. Some people with very severe epilepsy, everybody knows what epilepsy is, right? You have seizures. But they have such severe epilepsy that they're having like dozens of seizures every day. They literally cannot function. And there was a kind of surgery performed to treat people with this very extreme form of epilepsy. And it involved severing the corpus callosum. Now, why did that cure them? Well, because epilepsy is something to do with electrical discharge. And what was happening was you were having little electrical storms in one hemisphere, and it was zipping across the corpus callosum into the other hemisphere and kind of building. It had an amplification effect, and it built and built, and they were having these grand mal seizures. Once you severed that, it wasn't able to have this same magnification effect. And in effect, it cured the epilepsy. But now, the two hemispheres of their brain could not communicate. Now, we do know that an awful lot of the functions of each hemisphere are duplicated in the other one. The one exception is speech. Speech is controlled by your left hemisphere. I bet in some people it is in the right hemisphere and not the left hemisphere. And in fact, I would bet that some people who have had damage to the left hemisphere develop speech capacities in their right hemisphere, because we are amazing creatures and we can we can, people have been, there was one case of a person who was found, who was functioned fairly normally, and then when they did a brain scan of her, they found that her brain was effectively hollow, and she only had a sort of thin casing of brain round an empty space inside her head, and yet she was able to function as a human being. So we're very adaptable. Okay, now in these cases where their corpus callosum was severed, and there aren't that many of these people, and they've stopped doing the surgery, so the people it was done to have been studied to death, and you will see one of them being interviewed. But what happens is you can actually feed information to one hemisphere that is not fed to the other, because one hemisphere is connected with, actually I don't think it's as simple as one is connected to one eye and the other is connected to the other. One is connected to parts of one eye and parts of the other. But however they did it, they made these special glasses so that they could show an image to this hemisphere that this hemisphere couldn't see, and vice versa. They could show an image to this hemisphere that this hemisphere couldn't see. So Parfit says, imagine that you show a color red to this one and the color blue to this one. And what is true is that the left hemisphere controls the right hand, and the right hemisphere controls the left hand. So they put pens in each hand, and they said, write what you see. And of course, the one that sees blue writes blue, and the one that sees red writes red, and then ask, write how many colors you see, and each of them writes one. So what's going on? Well, this is a problem for what Parfit calls the ego theory, or at least he intends it to be a problem for that. But before going on to that, it's worth pointing out that because of this possibility of duplication, you could have these two function separately. And the scary thing, of course, is you want to know, wait a minute, are there two people in my head? Because what's happened with this case of the person with the corpus callosum, it seems like they're having two streams of consciousness. That just seems obviously confirmed by this experiment, that there is two streams of consciousness, each of which is not aware of the other. How to explain this? Now, at this point, Parfit makes a distinction between two groups of theories of personal identity. And as it's not using the terminology that we're already familiar with, it's worth saying a little bit about these. He says, most people are ego theorists. Now, what ego theorists say is, for a person to continue existing, there must be a continually existing subject of experience. And he quotes Reid, our old friend Reid, as saying, I am not a set of experiences. I am a thing that has experience. I am not thought, this is on page 2. I am not action. I am not feeling. I am something which thinks and acts and feels. So what I am is the subject of my experiences, not the experiences themselves. And of course, this is exactly what Descartes said. Descartes said, he didn't say, I am thought. He said, I am a thinking thing. So I am a thing that is separate from the experiences. What the bundle theory says is there's nothing over and above the experiences. The experiences, well, and your body and everything. Parfit, doesn't deny that you're made of flesh and blood, but there is no, for example, soul. The bundle theory says there's no thing over and above the experiences that can survive without the experiences. He says that, there's nothing above and beyond the experiences. So, to to illustrate the distinction between the ego and the bundle theory, he gives this little story of a club. And this is on page, page 5. Okay, suppose that a certain club exists for some time, holding regular meetings. I don't know, the Flint chapter of the Portland Trail Blazers fan club, okay? Pretty small organization. Now, it meets for some time, has regular meetings. The meetings then cease. Some years later, several people form a club with the same name. Maybe, the original fans of the Portland Trail Blazers die, or move away from Flint, so the chapter disbands, and then some other people form a club with the same name. They call themselves, they say, is this name taken? Nope, there's no existing groups called the Flint chapter of the Portland Trail Blazers fan club. All right. And it's by coincidence, they have the same name and the same club rules. They meet on the same day, whatever. We can ask, did these people revive the very same club, or did they merely start up another club? Now, what's the point of this question? The point of this question is supposed to be analogous to transportation, because we ask, suppose we do teleport, and it works, it's only one. So it's the normal teleportation case, it's not duplication. We ask of this person in Paris, are they merely a replica of the original, or are they the original? And what Parfit says, because he's a bundle theory, he says that's an empty question. It's as empty as asking, is this new club the same as the old club? Any answer you give will be just made up. Maybe you decide, yeah, it's the same club. Maybe you decide, no, it's a new club. Who cares, he says. There's no difference in what's being described. It's a club. It exists. It has that name. So he says something like that is what's going on here. It's just, what he wants to push is that the issue of whether or not this person is the same person as that one is a dead end. Talking about personal identity, remember identity is to do with being numerically the same. Is this numerically the same as that one? He says, don't get caught up in that question. The question of personal identity is a very black and white issue. And because it's black and white issue, because there can only be one in cases of identity, that's why you can't have both of them be the same one, because you can't have B be a different person from C, and yet both of them be the same person as A. Because you can't have that, that's the logic of identity, you're forced to say silly things like neither of them are. And he asks the question, but that's stupid. Shouldn't double success be better? Because suppose I get split, then I have twice the chances of survival of persons with my memories going on and doing good things or surviving to an old age. So Parfit suggests that instead we should talk about survival by degrees. So survival can be something that happens in terms of degrees rather than either happens or doesn't. Identity is an either-or thing. It's either this is completely the same person as that one, or it's not at all. You can't have half identity. Whereas survival, you can have 50% survival. So you could say this person survives 50% in here and 50% in here. Or, Parfit talks about this in his huge book, Reasons and Persons, which is an amazing book, but pretty heavy going in parts. He suggests that I should care much more about me in 5 minutes' time than I should me in 30 years' time, which actually leads to all kinds of problems about planning for retirement. we always say, oh, you should be putting stuff away for retirement. And Parfit says, well, why? That person 30 years from you is only like 1% the same as you, because they've forgotten a lot about what it was like to be you, and it might have different values. So why should you care so much about what happens to that person? You should care a lot more about what happens to the person who exists in 5 minutes, who will be almost identical to you. You should throw a lot more of your time and money into that person. And actually, Parfit also thinks that if there are people like you who exist now, you should care more about them than you should care about you a long time in the future. Because why should you care about this old stranger who might hate what you are now, and you might hate them? You know, like hippies in the 60s who turned into yuppies in the 80s. If they'd known what they were going to become, they wouldn't have tried to care for themselves because they hate the person they become. Parfit talks about all these issues, and it's very interesting. But in this reading, perhaps what we should focus on, oh yes, the split brain cases. He says, why does Parfit think that the split brain cases are an argument for the bundle theory? Well, he says, well, what can an ego theory say about the split brain cases? He says, well, one suggestion is they can say, well, there aren't really two streams of consciousness. There's just one. But he says that's just not borne out by the experiment. Obviously, both of them are able to write the name of a color. And besides, if because we usually when your hemispheres are connected, one of the hemispheres is dominant, and it's the one with the speech. But that doesn't mean that the other one isn't a separate stream of consciousness, says Parfit. It just means that it's not currently dominant. But if you destroy the dominant one, then we would say that you still survive. That happens to people. They have horrific strokes in one hemisphere, and the other hemisphere survives perfectly. And we say they are diminished, but they're the same person. So if it's possible to survive with the subdominant hemisphere, then obviously it had consciousness to begin with. So he says, it's no good saying there's only one stream of consciousness. Clearly there are two streams of consciousness. So what else can the ego theorists say? Well, they can say that there are two persons. There are two persons existing because there are two subjects of experience. And it seems like they are forced to say that because they say that there are, they say what you are is the subject of experience. But, says Parfit, think about this. Does that mean all of us are two persons all the time? Well, if you're saying that, why would you believe that? What's the evidence for saying that you're two persons? You don't think you're two persons. So, whereas the ego theory is supposed to win out because it fits better with our experience. We think we are a subject of experience, and that seems to support the ego theorists. And the other advantage of the ego theorist is it helps explain unity of consciousness. That is, what binds one experience that I had 5 years ago with an experience now? The answer is they're two separate experiences. What combines them? What connects them? And the ego theorist is they both happen to me. So the advantage of the ego theory, according to the ego theorists, who include people like Descartes, but possibly even Locke, because even though Locke says consciousness, he doesn't explain the implications of his view fully, but certainly Descartes. The advantage that Descartes say, the advantage of Descartes' ego theory is that they explain what binds particular experiences together. So this isn't just an experience of blue, and this isn't just an experience of, I don't know, suppose I've got an apple. There's not just an experience of red and an experience of sweet, sort of floating around unconnected. They're connected together because they're both had by the same subject of experience, by me. But that's why split brains are a problem, because there are two streams of consciousness. Now, in normal cases, the ego theorists have always said there's only one person in my brain. But in cases of split brains, what do they say? If they say there are two persons in split brain cases because there are two streams of consciousness. And each of the streams of consciousness, as Parfit points out, have a unity of consciousness. He points out, you know, the one hemisphere that experiences the color blue also has the experience of writing the word blue. So that's two different experiences that are had by the same stream of consciousness, that are combined. So there's a unity there. But there's also a unity between the other one's experience of the color red and of writing the word red. So there's a unity there too. So if the advantage of ego theorists is that they explain unity of consciousness, well, there's unity within each stream of consciousness, and there isn't unity between them because they don't have the same experience of color. Incidentally, these people with severed corpus callosums have occasional weird side effects. They can function remarkably well. You'd think that they would be pulling each other apart because, you know, it's as if two different people are trying to control the body, one controlling one arm, the other controlling. But they can walk and they can play the piano, they can do all these things. So what's going on there? The answer that seems to be what someone like Parfit would say is that there are always different streams of consciousness, even when the corpus callosum is not severed. You've got two streams of consciousness going on in you. It's just that they can communicate more easily than in the case of a severed corpus callosum. Whereas if the ego theory wants to say there's only one person in normal cases, but there are two people in severed corpus callosum cases, then what are they saying? This is a particular problem if you believe that the subject of experience is a unique soul. Are you going to say that when they cut the corpus callosum, suddenly a new soul popped into existence, and there are now two souls? You cut the soul at the same time as you severed the corpus callosum. That just sounds crazy. So, otherwise, you would have to say that there's still only one person in the case of severed corpus callosum. But then why would you believe, you would say that streams of consciousness are not the same as persons. So you would say, well, you can have two streams of consciousness but be one person. But your whole reason for being an ego theorist is saying you are the subject of experience. You are the stream of consciousness. That explains the unity of consciousness. That seems totally out there to say that you can distinguish between person and streams of consciousness. So that's why Parfit thinks that severed corpus callosum split brain cases are an argument that seem to show that the ego theorist is on shaky ground. They seem to support the bundle theory. Well, the ego theorist can say, well, wait a minute. How do you explain unity of consciousness in normal cases? What is it that binds the bundle together? And this is where Parfit seems perhaps a little bit hard to follow. Here's what he says. As a bundle theorist, I believe that to say that there are two egos in the split brains are idle cogs. That is, they're things that don't do anything. There's no point to do it. If you remember Occam's razor, he would say, Occam's razor would say there's no point to saying that there are these two souls because they're not adding anything to our picture. They don't explain anything that can't be explained without them. There is another explanation of the unity of consciousness, both in ordinary cases and in split brain cases. This is on page 7. It is simply a fact that ordinary people are at any time aware of having several different experiences. This awareness of several different experiences can be helpfully compared with one's awareness in short-term memory of several different experiences. Just as there can be a single memory of having just had several experiences. So that single memory is what brings together the different experiences. And like we might say, I have a single memory of an apple, but of course the apple itself is several different experiences. It's a color experience, it's a taste experience, and so on. So consciousness, so these ideas can sort of clump together. I say I have a single memory, even though it breaks down into separate, smaller memories. So it's as if experience itself clumps together without needing to say that there is this thing separate from the experiences that is having the experiences. The experiences themselves can unite into clumps or bundles. Now this sounds pretty weird. And he says, well, but Buddha's on my side. And people have been saying Buddhists are weird for centuries. And he quotes some Buddhist texts. For example, someone saying, a Buddhist is asked what their name is, what they're called, and he says, well, I can give you my name, but there's no person here. It doesn't refer to anything because there's nothing over and above what I'm made of. Just like the case of the club. Clubs are composed of the people in them. There's nothing sort of spiritual that links this later club called the Flint chapter of the Portland Trailblazers fan that would link or wouldn't link with the previous one. There's just a bunch of people here and a bunch of people there. To ask the question, but is it the same one, is pointless. Finally, another argument that Parfit gives for supporting the bundle theory over the ego theory is he imagines a spectrum of cases. He says, imagine on the this far end of the spectrum of cases, I just have like one atom replaced. I don't even notice. This is happening to us all the time. I've had probably millions of atoms replaced in the time that it takes me to say this. So nobody would deny that this is obviously still me. So I can exchange one atom, and it's obviously still me. Nobody, no theorist would deny that that's still me. But then at the other end of the spectrum, 100% of my atoms are new. Now, this looks just the same as this one. So this one is either a complete replica, a perfect replica. It's qualitatively identical with the original me. But the question is it numerically identical? Or at least that's what most theorists of personal identity worry about. So this would be, like he says, the normal case of teleportation. Because the one made in Paris is made of entirely new atoms that were already in Paris. The way it works is that you destroy this one, and then you sort of 3D print a perfect replica at the destination. So the perfect replica is made out of atoms that were already there. You don't send the atoms down the wire. Then it's made of atoms that were already there. But it's a perfect replica complete with memories and so on. Now, someone like Bernard Williams would say, this is not me. This is just a replica. Well, says Parfit, okay, suppose we take that seriously. This is obviously still me. This is obviously not me. What's the cutoff point in between? At what point between like 0.0001% and 100%, this is obviously me. This is, let's say, Bernard Williams is right, and it's not me. What's the cutoff point where it stops being me? How many atoms can I afford to lose? And let's say there is a cutoff point. If there is a cutoff point, then that means that one atom makes the difference. Because let's say the cutoff point is at X number of atoms, like 10 billion. Well, then 9,999,000 whatever atoms, 10 billion minus 1, is me. And then 10 billion, it's not me. So that one atom makes the difference between me existing and me not existing, between life and death, at least if you buy the ego theory, if you say that that identity is an all or nothing thing. But, says Parfit, that's crazy. One atom can't make the difference. And as he says, so there are two questions that the ego theorists ask. And we tend to ask too, because he says we tend to, even if we don't believe in souls, and he assumes most people don't believe in souls because I guess most Oxford professors didn't believe in souls, and that's all who he hung out with. But even if you don't believe in a soul, he says we tend to have these ego theorist intuitions. And he says we tend to think that the question, this is on page 4, will I survive? Will the resulting person after the exchange of molecules, will the resulting person be me? We tend to think, we have the assumption that there is an answer to that question. What's the cutoff point? Will it be me? He says we assume that there, will I survive? Our assumptions are that there is an answer to this question. That's one assumption. And the second assumption is that the answer is either yes or no. And he says both assumptions we need to abandon, because there is no there obviously is no real difference between losing one atom and not losing one atom, between the 10 billion and the 10 billion minus 1. That isn't a difference that makes the difference between whether or not I survive. So what he suggests here is there is no cutoff point. There is no point at which I exist and on the other side of it I don't exist. So therefore this whole idea is ridiculous. He sums up the bundle theory this way. As Buddha claimed, this is on page 5, as Buddha claimed, the bundle theory is hard to believe. It is hard to accept that it could be an empty question whether one is about to die or will instead live for many years. Yeah, I would say so. It is pretty hard to accept that. But the other thing he says about this on page 6, what you want, suppose you're deciding whether or not to teleport to Mars. You want the person on Mars to be you in a specially intimate way in which no future person will ever be you. No person, no matter if they were created to be exact replicas of you. This means that, judged from the standpoint of your natural beliefs, even ordinary survival is about as bad as teleportation. Ordinary survival is about as bad as being destroyed and having a replica, he says. So basically he says, don't worry, use the transporter. So long as there's someone who exists, who has all your memories and all your personality, that counts. That's as good as it being you. Now the question is, but is it me? Is that person the same person as me? Parfit is saying, stop worrying about that. You can't, that's not an issue that makes sense anymore. Just ask, will it have memories of being me? That's good enough. And that's Parfit's view. So he does two things. And they don't seem to be compatible with each other. One thing he does is he saves a version of Locke's theory. And in fact, it's basically Parfit who comes up with the single stream theory and comes up with responses to Reid's theory. So he says, essentially he's saying, if you want to be a Lockean, and it's a pretty good theory, here's the best version, single stream theory. But then he goes on to point out problems with the single stream theory and says, maybe we should stop caring about this question, will that person in the future be me? Instead, we should talk about, will that person in the future have memories like mine, have memories that are the same as mine? And if they will, then I will survive. And if more than one person has memories in the future of being me, that's even better. I have twice the chance of living on. Now, of course, these people have their own lives, but they're connected to you. So you can continue on. It's a bit like some people say, I want to live on in my work. You know, some writers say that. I want to live on in my work. You know, in other words, after I die, my work will continue. People will know what I thought. Woody Allen had an answer to that, which sounds like Bernard Williams. He says, I don't want to live on in my work. I want to live on in my apartment. Parfit says, according to Parfit's theory, living on in your work would count as a certain degree of survival. And so if you find that comforting, Parfit's the man for you.